Nai Rong and Nai Yuan flew in the sky outside the imperial city. At the beginning, they'd intentionally slowed down for the sake of taking care of Duan Ling Tian, but along with them slowly increasing their speed, when they noticed that Duan Ling Tian followed unhurriedly by their sides from the beginning until the end, they couldn't help but be stunned. Father's cultivation is at the 4th level of the void prying stage, whereas, my cultivation is at the 3rd level of the void prying stage. Little Tian is actually capable of following unhurriedly behind me while I'm flying at full speed now, and he seems to be at ease like father. Nai Yuan couldn't help but gasp. Wouldn't that mean that little Tian's current cultivation is already at the 4th level of the void prying stage or above? Nai Yuan was shocked, and Nai Rong was equally shocked. He'd lived for more than half his life before obtaining his current cultivation, yet the little fellow by his side seemed to only be turning 30 in another 2 or 3 years. What sort of natural talent is this? Even if it was within the strongest sect in the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom, the Azure Forest Tri-sect, such a natural talent would probably be at the top, right? Little Tian, I heard you joined a sect in the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom. Nai Rong asked suddenly. Yes. Duan Ling Tian nodded. Which sect did you join? Nai Rong asked curiously. Duan Ling Tian wasn't in time to speak when Nai Yuan, who flew on the other side of Nai Rong, had opened his mouth already, and he looked at Duan Ling Tian before saying slowly, Little Tian, with your natural talent, there's probably no one in the 7-star sword sect you joined that's capable of comparing to you in natural talent, right? When Duan Ling Tian returned the last time, Nai Yuan had vaguely heard Duan Ling Tian unintentionally mention the sect he joined, so Nai Yuan had always remembered it in his heart. Of course, he wasn't so familiar with the sects of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom, and he didn't know that the 7-star sword sect was the former number 1 sect in the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom. But even though he didn't know, it didn't represent that Nai Rong didn't. Nai Rong's pupils constricted when he heard Nai Yuan, and he looked at Duan Ling Tian with slight astonishment. Little Tian, you. The sect you joined all those years ago was the 7-star sword sect. Yes. Duan Ling Tian knew when he saw Nai Rong's current expression that Nai Rong had probably knew some things about the 7-star sword sect. The facts proved that Duan Ling Tian's guess was correct. Nai Rong took a deep breath and said slowly, according to my knowledge, 5 years ago, the 7-star sword sect was jointly annihilated by the other 3 great sects of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom that formed the 5 great sects of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom, right? And the Mountain Split sect seemed to have been annihilated as well. Duan Ling Tian hadn't replied when the nearby Nai Yuan was already stunned. Since he was in the Crimson Sky Kingdom, he'd never heard about these matters that were spread and gave rise to much discussion in the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom, so he didn't know. The Seven-Star Sword sect was annihilated 5 years ago. Meanwhile, Na Yuan couldn't help but recall that when Duan Lingtian left the sect in the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom and returned to the Crimson Sky Kingdom all those years ago, it seemed to have been 5 years ago. In this way, Duan Lingtian had returned to the Crimson Sky Kingdom after the Seven-Star Sword sect was annihilated. This was something that he didn't have the slightest knowledge of. Little Tian. For a time, Na Yuan looked at Duan Lingtian, and he couldn't help but ask. Is what my father said true? The Seven-Star Sword sect was annihilated 5 years ago. Whereas, when you returned to the Crimson Sky Kingdom all those years ago, it was after the Seven-Star Sword sect was annihilated. Yes. Duan Lingtian's gaze flashed as he nodded, as it wasn't a secret to him. Little Tian, it's already extremely fortunate that you were able to survive after the Seven-Star Sword sect was annihilated. Are you in the Azure Forest Tri-sect now? Nai Rong asked. As far as he was concerned, even though Duan Lingtian's natural talent wasn't bad, yet it was impossible for Duan Lingtian to survive under the siege of the Azure Forest Tri-sect. The reason Duan Lingtian was able to survive ought to be because Duan Lingtian had betrayed the Seven-Star Sword sect and turned to the Azure Forest Tri-sect. Azure Forest Tri-sect. Duan Lingtian snickered in his heart. It was a mystery what the senior Marquis's expression would be if he knew that the Azure Forest Tri-sect had been exterminated under Duan Lingtian's hand. What? You aren't a disciple of the Azure Forest Tri-sect now? Nai Rong couldn't help but ask a step further when he saw Duan Lingtian neither agreeing nor disagreeing. No. Duan Lingtian shook his head, and then he said, I'm still a disciple of the Seven-Star Sword sect. I knew that you're a good child that knows how to repay another's kindness, and it's impossible for you to betray your sect and turn to the Azure Forest Tri-sect that annihilated your own section. Originally, Nai Yuan's feelings were slightly complicated when he heard what Nai Rong asked Duan Lingtian. If Duan Lingtian has really betrayed the sect that fostered him and turned to an opposing sect, then even though Nai Yuan wouldn't say anything on the surface, he would surely have some complaints about Duan Lingtian in his heart. After all, that was a sect that had bestowed favor upon Duan Lingtian. Now, when he heard that Duan Lingtian hadn't betrayed Seven-Star Sword sect, Nai Yuan couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. Little Tian, according to my knowledge, the Azure Forest Tri-sect has always been searching for Seven-Star Sword sect disciples during the recent years, and they would surely annihilate any Seven-Star Sword sect disciple they noticed. Nai Rong had a worried expression as he said, Is the place you're at now safe? Grandpa Nai, don't worry, I'm extremely safe now. Duan Ling Tian was still extremely moved by Nai Rong's concern. That's good. Nai Rong nodded and heaved a sigh of relief. Little Tian, I didn't know in the past that the 7-star sword sect you were in had already. Then wouldn't it have been extremely dangerous when you participated in the genius competition held by the imperial family of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom? Nai Yuan asked. 1 year ago, the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom's imperial family had greatly rewarded the Crimson Sky Kingdom and allowed the Crimson Sky Kingdom to be relieved of taxes for 10 years, whereas, all of this was exactly because of Duan Ling Tian's contribution. Because Duan Ling Tian had passed through the selection in the genius competition and successfully advanced to obtain the qualification to participate in the Darkstone Empire's Young Genius competition. What? Little Tian, you participated in the genius competition all those years ago. Nai Rong's eyes opened wide like saucers, and he had an expression of shock when he heard this. Father, it was I and His Majesty that asked Little Tian to represent the Crimson Sky Kingdom too. Nai Yuan spoke slightly weakly. Ridiculous. Nai Rong snapped. What would we do if something happened to Little Tian? Truly ridiculous. Fortunately, Little Tian is fine, otherwise, how could you be worthy of being his uncle? How could you be worthy of being Ru Feng's friend? Nai Yuan was scolded to the point of being speechless. Grandpa Nai, don't blame Uncle Nai. I was afraid Uncle Nai would be worried about me, so I didn't tell him about the matter of the 7-star sword sect being annihilated. Duan Ling Tian helped Nai Yuan out of his predicament. The three of them continued flying for a while before Nai Yuan couldn't help but asked. Little Tian, you went to the Darkstone Empire later on and competed with the group of young geniuses of the Darkstone Empire. What was the cultivation of the strongest young genius that appeared when the young genius competition started? Nai Yuan was extremely curious about this. An imperial kingdom surpassed a kingdom, and it was enough for him to look up to, whereas, an empire even surpassed an imperial kingdom, and it was an existence that was difficult to reach for him even if he looked up to it. The strongest young genius. Duan Ling Tian pondered for a moment when he heard Nai Yuan, and he recalled. At that time, an existence at the 3rd level of the Void Initiation stage had appeared during the Darkstone Empire's Young Genius competition. He was the strongest existence amongst the 10 people that advanced from the Young Genius competition at that time. As for later on, there was also another existence at the 1st level of the Void Initiation stage. 3rd level of the Void Initiation stage? 1st level of the Void Initiation stage? Not only did Nai Yuan gasp, even Nai Rong had gasped when they heard Duan Ling Tian, and both of them sighed with emotion. As expected of the young geniuses of an empire, they've already broken through to the third level of the void initiation stage before the age of 38. Such natural talent is shocking. Perhaps, after another 10 years when little Tian is 38, you'll possess a similar achievement. Na Yuan looked at Duan Ling Tian and was filled with confidence towards Duan Ling Tian. As for whether Duan Ling Tian had advanced in the young genius competition of the Darkstone Empire, he didn't ask, because it was impossible for Duan Ling Tian to advance in his opinion. The young genius competition of the Darkstone Empire was already a matter of a year ago. As far as he was concerned, Duan Ling Tian was only at the 4th level of the void prying stage now, and Duan Ling Tian was probably at the 2nd or 3rd level of the void prying stage a year ago. It was utterly impossible for someone with such a cultivation to advance in the young genius competition of the Darkstone Empire. It was precisely because of these considerations that he didn't ask, as he was deeply afraid of discouraging Duan Ling Tian, whereas, since Na Yuan didn't ask, it was impossible that Duan Ling Tian was take the initiative to explain. The group of 3 continued to fly swiftly forward. 3 days later, the 3 of them had left the Crimson Sky Kingdom to enter the territory of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom. Actually, with Duan Ling Tian's current strength, he utterly wouldn't have taken so much time to head to the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom from the Crimson Sky Kingdom, and the reason he used such a long time was because of taking care of Na Yuan. He's maintained his speed at the same level as Na Yuan, the speed of a 3rd level void prying stage martial artist. Duan Ling Tian noticed something as he flew in the sky above the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom while following Na Yuan and Nai Rong. The direction they were heading was actually the direction of the location that formerly belonged to the demonic Lotus Blade sect, the demonic Lotus Blade Gorge, and it would seem like the second-rate sect Na Yuan's mother resided in was at that direction as well. On the way, Duan Ling Tian had intentionally found out about this second-rate sect, whereas, Na Yuan and Nai Rong had told him about everything without the slightest impatience. The sect my wife is from is called Flying Rainbow Sect, and it only accepts female disciples. So, everyone in the Flying Rainbow Sect from their sect leader, higher UPS, and all their disciples, they are all female disciples, said Nai Rong slowly. Duan Ling Tian nodded, and he couldn't help but be slightly shocked in his heart at the same time. A sect that was completely formed from female disciples was actually capable of becoming a second-rate sect of the Azure Forest Imperial Kingdom. It was truly shocking. After all, the natural talent of female martial artists in Cloud Continent were inferior to male martial artists since birth, and this was an iron law in Cloud Continent. So true experts in the cloud continent were normally men. Of course, it didn't mean that the natural talent of all female martial artists was inferior to male martial artists, and it was only in a general sense. There were also many female martial artists with natural talent that far exceeded male martial artists. Not to mention anyone else, Juice, his fiancée Ker, had revealed shocking natural talent since a young age, and had joined a great power in the foreign lands many years ago. Presumably, her strength at this moment was even more stronger. It was even to the extent that it was extremely likely that Ker's strength had surpassed him.